So far, we've been using some JavaScript syntax for our class components that has only relatively recently been introduced officially into the JavaScript language. Things like declaring our state as a class field and using arrow functions as a class method were not always an official part of classes in JavaScript. However, React was around before some of these features existed, and therefore there's an even older syntax that I wanted to touch on really quick. This might be helpful to you if you happen to come across an older tutorial or maybe are working in an older codebase. So let's start with this class field. In JavaScript classes, before class fields were really a part of the language, you had to initialize any values that you wanted your class to contain inside of a method called Constructor. And it's important to note that this method is not a React lifecycle method or anything like that. It's actually something that's a part of the JavaScript language. As the name indicates, it's a chance to construct the object that will be created when you create an instance of this class. And in React, we create instances of these classes every time we make an instance of our component like this using JSX. Because our class is extending from react.component, we need to first call a function called super. What this does is it essentially calls the constructor method of the parent component or the parent class that we are extending from. And by doing this, we connect our component, our class component, to the prototype of the parent component in react.component. And in the end, this allows us to use this.setState. There's one other point I'll make with this constructor and super, but first what we can do now that we have a constructor is we can move our state declaration up inside the constructor, but then we need to add the this keyword before state. Just like most of the things that we're talking about in this lesson, this is something specific to JavaScript, not necessarily React alone. Using this.state essentially says I want to add a property called state on top of this object that we're creating an instance of, which again is what happens whenever we create an instance of our component. Another thing you will oftentimes see in React class components with this constructor is when they pass in the props keyword here, and then we'll call super, passing props to that super function. The truth is, unless you are planning on using this.props inside of your constructor, this really isn't necessary, so I'm going to take this out, but just know that that's a thing in case you end up needing it or seeing it out in the wild. That pretty much does it for the constructor for now. We're going to come back to it in just a minute, but the next thing I wanted to address was the concept of having an arrow function as your class method. Similar to the class field that we saw before when we were declaring state, arrow function support inside of classes was not always a given. Now let's see what happens when I turn this back into a regular method by removing my arrow, and I'll hit refresh, open my console, and click the button which triggers this .toggleGoOut, and we get an error. Now the error here in Scrimba is a little bit opaque, so let me copy the error from my actual developer tools and we'll see exactly what that looks like. Okay, it says there's a type error, cannot read properties of undefined, reading set state. Sometimes I've seen this as cannot call set state of undefined. Whatever the error actually says, the point is the keyword this inside of toggleGoOut is now an undefined value. As it turns out, the reason that the keyword this is undefined inside of this function is a bit confusing. It has to do with the way that the this keyword is treated inside of classes in JavaScript. It also has to do with how the this keyword gets essentially lost when we pass the this.toggleGoOut function as a callback function to our onClick handler. And so there's not many times I'm going to say this, but I'm going to teach you the quick solution to this, but I'm also going to recommend that you not be too terribly concerned about why this works. And if you really won't be able to let that one go, then a quick Google search should really help you understand a bit more deeply. Just know that you're about to jump into a deep rabbit hole there. Obviously, the easy solution for this is just to use arrow functions, but assuming you're working in a codebase that for some reason isn't using arrow functions, or if you're looking at a tutorial, you'll see a line like we're about to write up inside of our constructor, whose whole job is to essentially ensure that even when we pass this function as a callback to our onClick, it won't lose its this context. And therefore, this will not be undefined, but instead it will be able to successfully look at the setState method from above. Inside our constructor, what I'll do is I'm going to essentially bind the this.toggleGoOut function to the this context that exists within the constructor. And I'll do that by saying this.toggleGoOut equals this.toggleGoOutAgain.bind, and then I want to bind it to this context. Believe me, I know that this is confusing. Unfortunately, because there are much better syntaxes around for doing this, I'm not going to necessarily bother you to learn this in depth. One thing that might help a little bit is to know that when you call .bind on top of a function, it will return a new function that essentially ensures that function can exist within this object. In our case, we're using the this keyword to represent the object, but it doesn't have to be the this keyword. Anyway, the point is now I have bound my toggleGoOut function inside the constructor, and now my toggleGoOut class method should be able to successfully run this.setState. So let's refresh, and it looks like everything is working the way we would expect. So let me clean up this comment here, and I'm going to add a couple comments on top of the things that we've learned in case anybody's more of a visual or a reading learner. Okay, let's start with class fields. If for some reason you can't use a class field in your component, then you'll need to make use of the class's constructor method. Inside the constructor method, you will initialize your state object, which now you have to put a this dot in front of. And even before that, you need to make sure that you call the super function. Again, this just connects your class component into the prototype chain of the react.component that it's extending from, which allows your app component to access some of the goodies that come from react.component, like the this.setState method, things like this.props, and so forth. Speaking of props, if you do need to use this.props inside of your constructor specifically, you'll need to make sure that you pass props to both the constructor method and the super function. Again, that's only if you need to access props or this.props inside of your constructor. Otherwise, you can leave it out. I think this time I'll leave it there just for reference. Next, if you can't use arrow functions inside of your class methods, then you'll need to use a regular class method like we have here, and you'll want to bind it inside of the constructor the way that we've done here. The syntax is confusing, but you will get used to it if you're working in a codebase that's using this. I suppose as a side note, technically you don't need to bind your class method in the constructor if you are not using something like this.setState, or maybe more specifically, if you are not both passing this class method as a event handler inside your render and using this.setState. But honestly, understanding those things are probably more confusing than it's worth at this point. It might be easiest to say if you're using this.setState, then you'll want to make sure that you bind your method inside of your constructor. That'll probably cover most use cases that you find yourself in. Okay, that's plenty of talking for me. Spend some time reading through these notes, playing around with the code, and then next we'll jump into a challenge where you get to practice this a bit more.